have all helped us in doing this great work.
In this morning's session, students from the Alpha Learning Academy of Orlando, Florida, supported by their principal, Ms. Shaquila Henderson, transformed virtual learning to a literacy learning whiteboard as they read more than anything else. As enslaved child, Booker Teleferro Washington, smart as a whip, learned to read without calling attention to himself. #rights.
Spirits of hope and resilience were fortified by keynoter Jamal Sawo, homegrown, humble, so competent as he shared his story. Panel participants, Dr. Levon Wright-Bracey, Dr. Ann Shilliford Butler, Ms. Brandy Gurley, each completed the narrative with, "What shall we tell our children?"
And now it's time to begin anew. It's afternoon. Knowing, doing. It's our sub-theme. Erica? All right, I think Erica's having technical difficulties. So good afternoon, everyone. I will speak on behalf of our doctoral student, Erica, and she was going to speak about Amanda Gorman. Would one of our doc students like to jump in? Phoenicia?
Yes. Knowing, Amanda Gorman, in The Gift of Gratitude, puts it this way: we all know what needs to be done. It's the doing that is the challenge. Starting us off this afternoon, we have human rights activist, pioneer for racial equality, internationally recognized expert on sports and social issues, scholar, author, and often described as the Rachel's conscience of sport, Dr. Richard Lapchick. Dr. Lapchick brought his commitment to equality and his belief that sport can be an effective instrument of positive social change to University of Central Florida in August 2001, where he launched the DeVos Sports Business Management Program. In 2015, it was named the #2 program in the world by Sports Business International. Lapchick is a prolific writer. His 17th book was published in 2018. Lapchick is a regular columnist for ESPN.com and the Sports Business Journal. He has spoken in the United States Congress, at the United Nations, in the European Parliament. He was inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame of the Commonwealth Nations in the category of humanitarian, along with Arthur Ashe and Nelson Mandela. Join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Richard E. Lapchick.
I think there's a video, please.
Please stand by, just one moment. So sorry.
Dr. Slanda, I'll take a moment and I'll share my screen. My apologies. Dr. Slanda, I apologize. I'm having technical difficulties, but I believe that Eric will be able to pick it back up.
apologies, Dr. Lapchick. Unfortunately, the video won't be able to play.
Not to worry. I'll just start then.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be asked to be your keynote speaker here this afternoon. Anytime the subject is about getting off the sidelines and getting on the front lines and doing, instead of just talking about things, it's a place I want to be. So congratulations on the subject. I'm sure when you planned this week, you never would have thought what this week would fall in, between the verdict of the Chauvin trial, another funeral, and Dante Wright, another police shooting, and Nakia Bryant. Today, the headline of the Orlando Sentinel, our hometown, is that the Orlando County Deputy Sheriff who shot Salathius Melvin on August 7th was able to return to work without the investigation being completed. It seems all too familiar and all too frequent. I'm from the world of sport. It's a completely different world today than it was 15 months ago. Between the pandemic and the racial reckoning, sports and society will just never be the same. Sports were on the sideline for almost 6 months, but I was proud of what sports did during that period of time. You may remember that it was on a Wednesday afternoon in March that an NBA player tested positively, and Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, immediately shut down the league. Within 2 days, all of the rest of the sport was shut down in the United States. This was at a time when the federal government was not doing much to shut things down. It's estimated that if they had shut things down at the time the NBA did, then more than 50,000 lives would have been saved, but we all know what the outcome was. We saw the big-heartedness of sport. In Orlando last night, Zion Williamson had his debut with the New Orleans Pelicans. On the day after the league was shut down, Zion Williamson, who had yet to play in a game in the NBA, donated $1 million to support the workers at the arena that the Pelicans wouldn't be playing in last year, as well as for COVID relief efforts. In the next month and a half, the NBA players in other leagues, teams, coaches, and the leagues themselves donated more than $150 million to fight COVID and to help the workers who were becoming unemployed as a result of the closing of sports. There was that vacuum in the world of sports, and we missed sport, at least those of us who are sports fans. But suddenly, the murder of George Floyd changed everything around. The subject of police brutality became a common subject in our streets and in our institutions of higher education pretty much everywhere, as it should have been all along. In 2019, there were only 27 days in the United States when a police officer did not shoot and kill a citizen of their community. 54% of those killed were people of color. Obviously, many of those were in the line of duty, but there were too many cases like that of George Floyd. The discussion of police brutality opened up a discussion of systemic racism in a deeper way than I think I've seen in my lifetime. We're talking about racism as it affects healthcare, housing, education, the financial institutions who are responsible for lending money to different communities, and of course, the criminal justice system. Sports played a significant role with the protests that athletes engaged in during the games that they ended up playing in the fall as sports resumed. And our athlete activists have been prominent role models, I think, for society. Our athletes are probably the most diverse professional group in the United States, and they have the ear and their voice and a platform to have tremendous influence. They're helping us face a series of uncomfortable truths. The uncomfortable truth in the racial reckoning is that all acts of racism and forms of racism can be drawn right back in a direct line to 1619 with the beginning of slavery. The Me Too movement a couple of years ago forced us to look at how sexist and misogynistic we are as a society. The renaming of the football team in Washington reopened the discussion of the fact that America was founded on the slaughter of the indigenous people of the United States. In our hometown, nearly 5 years ago now, it's hard to believe, the Pulse nightclub shooting forced us again to confront how deep homophobia runs in this country. We see too many acts of anti-Semitism regularly around the country, and we are certainly a violent country. We read about sometimes after a weekend that 10 or 12 school-age children in Chicago or other communities were killed over the weekend, and seem horrified, but on any given day in the United States, on average, 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound. We are a violent society. The election brought change and hope, but for me, I can't shake the fact that 48% of the American people voted for Donald Trump. That's a large number of people, and a significant percentage, of course, have white supremacist values that have forced us to look at America in a different way in the past year. So I'll go into a little bit about my personal background, which would have been covered in the video. So I'll take a minute to do that now. I want to start by saying my background is told me who to listen to, who were going to be the vital voices in my life. So when I was 5 years old, I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and I saw my father's image swing from a tree with people under the tree picketing. For several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. I didn't know what any of that meant as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old boy, but I knew that there were a lot of people who didn't like this man who was my favorite person on the planet. And it was because as the coach of the New York Knicks in 1950, he signed the first Black player in the history of the NBA. In 1952, my dad asked me if I'd like to come meet Jackie Robinson. He and Jackie Robinson were going to be the co-keynote speakers at a fundraiser at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And I had no idea who Jackie Robinson was in terms of his social significance, but he was the star of the team I rooted for. I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan. So I met Jackie, spent a couple of minutes with him, was overwhelmed by his presence. After it was over, Jackie went home to be with his wife, Rachel. And I hope many people in the audience have seen the movie 42 or the Ken Burns documentary on Jackie Robinson, because it portrayed the incredible love affair between Rachel and Jackie Robinson. I'm happy to tell you now, all these decades later, that was 1952. In 2020, literally the last thing I went to before the shutdown was the Jackie Robinson Foundation Gala. And I've been lucky enough to accompany Rachel Robinson to the gala for more than 20 consecutive years. She's now 98 years old. If you ever have the chance to be in her presence, seize the opportunity. She's an amazing human being. But back in New York, my dad had a reputation for courting the New York sports media. So after the fundraising event, he took the media to Mama Leone's, which was a famous Italian restaurant near the old Madison Square Garden. And in that bar area where everybody congregated, with the sports writers, who were, of course, all white men at the time, the most famous sports columnists in the country shouted across the bar to his colleagues, "Did you see that N?" referring to Jackie Robinson showboating. And I'll never forget, my father grabbed my arm in such a powerful way, I can still feel the grip sometimes when I think about it. And he said, "Some people only know how to hate." I didn't know what that meant as a 7-year-old boy. I just knew there was something terribly wrong in the country I was being raised in. So my dad is a double inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame as a player and as a coach. He was the center on the original Celtics, the dominant team of his era. He was the tallest player in the country. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade, one of the tallest players in the New York City area. And everybody told me I'd play in the NBA. I liked to hear that. I wanted that very much. But I was recruited by a school called Power Memorial, which was the top basketball program in the country, along with DeMatha in Washington, D.C. I chose not to go there, but became friends with the coach. And the next year, the coach asked me if I would come to his summer camp. Summer camps for basketball coaches now are very common. In 1961, they were virtually unheard of. But I went. He had 5 of his white players from Power Memorial and a black player at the camp. One of the white players, who's been a D1 basketball coach for the last 35 years, was dropping the N-word on the black guy from dawn till dusk until I finally challenged him on the 3rd day. He literally knocked me out cold. The black guy's name at the time was Lou Alcindor, became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a lifelong friendship began. It's been such a profound friendship that when Kareem got the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the last month of Barack Obama's administration, I was one of his 2 guests, along with Henry Louis Gates from Harvard. When Kareem's statue was unveiled at the Staples Center several years ago, he asked me to speak at it. Kareem actually came and spoke at a UCF commencement and taught Taco Fall, our former ball player who stopped that man Zion Williamson in the game against Duke several years ago. He taught Taco Fall his skyhook. So all that is a reflection of how long and profound the friendship has been. But as a 15-year-old white kid, the importance of my friendship with Kareem at that time was that I suddenly had a young, urban African-American lens with which to look at what racism was doing in his community and other communities of color around the country. And I decided as a 15-year-old that I was going to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I had no idea what that meant at the time, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. I ended up getting my doctorate in international race relations. It was the first such degree in the country. And I did my doctoral dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response to it. And I compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 1930s. I started teaching at a college in Virginia in 1970. The dissertation got published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid and ended up founding the sports boycott of South Africa in the mid-1970s. There was a bank loan boycott against apartheid, an oil boycott, a trade boycott, and a sports boycott. You could smuggle in currency, you could smuggle in trade, you could smuggle in oil, but you couldn't play sports in the dark. And many people believe that the sports boycott became South Africa's Achilles heel. This is the only country that in the history of the world that the entire global community came together in peacetime to try to strangle, because apartheid was such a heinous system of government. If you were a person of color, and 81% of the people in South Africa were, you couldn't own land, you couldn't vote, you couldn't send your children to the school you wanted to. You were there to serve a very wealthy white economy in whatever role you fit into according to the dictates of that white population. So that's why the global community came together. The first South African sports team that was coming to the United States was a Davis Cup team coming to play in Nashville, Tennessee in 1978. They were playing in the North American zone because none of the European countries would compete with South Africa anymore because the boycott was completely effective in Europe. So my job as the head of the coalition that came together to boycott South Africa was to get the matches canceled. I flew to Nashville. I was working with the African governments, which asked me to announce that they would boycott the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games if this team was allowed to come. So we held a press conference before my final speech of the weekend at Vanderbilt. And all three networks were there covering. A correspondent named Dick Schaap, who was a well-known sports broadcaster at the time, came up to me after the announcement, but before I spoke to the student body, and said that the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd, which was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, I thought maybe for the first time in my life, I had done something worthwhile. The next night I was working late in my college office. The office was in the school's library, which closed at 10:30. At 10:45, there was a knock on the door. I assumed it was the campus security doing a routine check because they saw lights on when the building was closed. So I didn't hesitate to open the door, but when I did, instead of campus security, it was two men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, a concussion, and carve the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. Laying there that night in the hospital bed, I knew that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and to the length they had gone to try to stop me that night, that they must have thought that us using the sports platform to address racism was being effective in countering racism in the United States. And I decided that I would spend the rest of my life using that sports platform to address various social justice issues, especially racism, but others that I'll touch on in a little bit. So I came out of the hospital, and I usually don't tell this part of the story, but because of everything that has gone on in the past year with the police, I am going to share it with you. I got home on Friday. There were about 25 friends and supporters in our living room there to greet me. And a supporter from Nashville called to say that the afternoon newspaper, then known as the Nashville Banner newspaper, had run a page one story literally across the top of the paper, the headline of which said, "Lapchick wounds ruled and self-inflicted." And it was a story that a police source had leaked to the press that they thought I had self-inflicted these wounds. A neighbor who was an attorney said, "We better go talk to the police." So the next day we went down and met the detective in charge of the investigation. He denied that they leaked that story to the press, but obviously they did. And he said, "Listen, I believe the attack took place the way you said it did, but there are people on the force who don't. Why don't you take a lie detector to prove that the attack took place the way you said it did?" As I said earlier, have a PhD in international race relations, studied the civil rights movement, and knew how police used lie detectors with civil rights activists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I said it's very unlikely that I would agree to take it, but I would consult with all the leaders in our coalition, which were all the major civil rights leaders in the country. And if they thought that I should take it for the good of what we were trying to do, that I would agree to do so. Spoke to them all that night. And to a person, everyone said absolutely refused to take it based on principle. And before I fell asleep late that night, I thought about women who had been sexually assaulted being asked to prove that they had been sexually assaulted, and had some understanding of what it must be like for women to go through that with the police. The next morning, a local reporter called and said, "We understand you've been asked to take a lie detector. What are you going to do?" And I told them that after consulting with the leaders in the coalition that I was not going to take it. And I mentioned what I said about women and sexual assault. And in the next 2 months, I received nearly 200 phone calls and letters from women around the country who had been raped, thanking me for saying that at that particular time. And I don't have any doubt when 13 years later, I was approached by a former football player at Harvard to start a program on the issue of men's violence against women, that I heard the voices of those women in the back of my head and agreed to start what is now the largest program in the country teaching bystander behavior on the issue of men's violence against women. But back to this particular time, you can imagine what the story was like in a Virginia paper on Monday morning. Not only did it say Lapchick refused to take a lie detector, I must admit that growing up, if I read that somebody who was accused of a crime refused to take a lie detector, I would sometimes wonder, why wouldn't they just take it? Now I knew. But the writer also wrote, as I said, about those women, but in the context of that story, they said that a medical examiner came and examined Richard Lapchick in the hospital while he was there, and the medical examiner concluded that all of the wounds are consistent with self-infliction. So this particular medical examiner had stopped by to see me on a Saturday while I was in the hospital. He literally never looked at 1 inch of my body. He happened to be from India, the country, and talked about his sympathy for the anti-apartheid movement and appreciation of what I was trying to do. Literally never looked at my body. So on Monday morning, his determination that the wounds were consistent with self-infliction was the thread of the entire story. I was pretty angry at that particular point. You may have noticed with all the civil rights cases that have taken place in this past year, that in literally every case where somebody has been killed, the family of the person who had been the victim brought in a private medical examiner to examine the body after the police medical examiner had examined him. I didn't realize it when I was back in 1978. During this period of time last fall, the CBS News ran a story that there was a survey done of medical examiners, and 78% of medical examiners said that they had changed their opinion of what had happened in a case to conform with what the police's ruling was in the case. I found out later that medical examiners literally never look at living bodies. This medical examiner had never seen a living patient before, but that's how the police used them then and how they use them now. So I decided I better go back to Nashville and try to get the focus back on South Africa. When I got to Nashville, I realized nobody cared anymore whether South Africa was coming anymore or not. It was, did Lapchick do it? Didn't Lapchick do it? I flew to Washington and had a friend arrange for an FBI operative to privately administer a lie detector test to me, and flew to New York City, where we got a civil rights medical examiner to examine me. And when we released the results of those 2 tests at a press conference at the United Nations, the UN was very supportive of my work and announcing that the attack had taken place exactly as I said it did. And we flew back to Virginia that night on the understanding that I was going to be arrested as soon as we arrived in Virginia. The police were not at the airport. They obviously had heard about the results of the 2 tests and had backed off. But I knew that I definitely wanted to get out of Virginia at the time. And I was offered a job at the United Nations, which I took and went to the UN and worked there for the next 6 years. I know that people in the international community then, and to some degree now, think of racism as a Southern thing. So their opinion was, let's get Lapchick out of the South and get him up north where he'll be safe. I knew that wasn't true. But I was happy to be at the United Nations and out of Virginia at that particular time. So the next South African team that was coming, it was 1981. It was a rugby team on its way to New Zealand. They were going to play where rugby is a really important sport, unlike in the United States. And they were going to play 3 matches in the United States on their way to New Zealand. So we formed a coalition to try to get those matches stopped. We met every Thursday night at the Church Center for the United Nations across the street from the UN. We had 100 groups in the coalition. And on this particular night, we had learned that the first match scheduled for New York City had been canceled due to the potential protests. And I had coincidentally bought a car from a colleague at the United Nations that night. And when I drove home at the end of the meeting to our apartment on the Upper West Side, my family had bought a house in Woodstock, New York, where they were spending the summer and where we sometimes spent weekends. And I was going to drive up there the next day, but they came home to surprise me. And when I got to the apartment building, my family was scurrying about the lobby frantically because someone had broken into the apartment. They hadn't touched any of their things. The only thing they touched, and then they ransacked all of my things, and the only thing they took was the manuscript of a book I was writing about this particular period of time. The next day, the police told my family to go back up to Woodstock, so they got in the car and went back up to Woodstock the next morning. I went back to the United Nations, this time under heavy armed guard. At 11 o'clock that morning, the woman I had been married to at the time called me up and said, I'm okay, I'm okay. I didn't know there was a chance she wouldn't be okay, going 65 miles an hour on the New York State Thruway. The car's engine seized up, and thank God it was in the middle of the morning without much traffic, and she was able to wrestle the car to the side of the road, bringing herself and the children to safety. Someone, it turned out, had tampered with the engine on the streets of New York the night before. 2 days later, the local police found 2 men under the hood of the car we were replacing and chased them into Central Park. I tell you that part of the story to affirm what I said earlier, that racism exists in every nook and every cranny of the country. In 1992, I had been asked by Nelson Mandela to bring a program that we had started in the United States called Project Teamwork to South Africa. And I went to the National Basketball Association, the NBA, and asked for their support. And on the trip were David Stern, the commissioner of the NBA, Charlie Grantham, the head of the Players Association. The players were Patrick Ewing, Dikembe Mutombo, and Alonzo Mourning, who were 3 all-star players at the time, all are now Hall of Famers. The coaches were Wes Unseld and Lenny Wilkins. And when we arrived in South Africa, David Stern said to me, Rich, I know you're not going to like this, but the first place we go when we go to a new country is the American Embassy. So we went there. And if you have any vision of the people I said I'm walking with, the 3 players were all over 7 feet tall. The 2 coaches were 6'8" and 6'5". I never grew to that tall, great big man that I had hoped at one time. And the ambassador came right by all these towering figures and came up to me and he said, I want you to know I was here in 1978. I've been other places since, but in 1978, the people here, and I just want to clarify where the here was, my government's embassy, the people here, half of them wanted you killed. The other half considered you a hero. I want you to know I was in the latter group, and he took me into the secure area of the embassy where he pulled out a file folder with my name on it. And it was so thick that he put a ruler next to it. It was 3.5 inches thick. And when I opened it, it was a documentation of my daily movements from 1968 through 1981, the last time a South African team came. And he said they routinely shared that with the South African security forces. So you can see that my journey on the issue of race in sport has been both personal and profound. I have listened to other people in my life to get a handle on other issues. My sister was a powerful force in my life. So I'm 75, she's 87. She was a civil rights activist in the 50s before it was even called the Civil Rights Movement. She moved to Africa in 1961, which is when I started reading about Africa and falling in love with the continent. My wife, Anne, we've been married for the last 35 years, is a powerful feminist, as is our 31-year-old daughter. Whenever they hear something that is overtly sexist that I might have missed, they're quick to point out to me to make sure that I don't miss that for very long. The issue of sexism has become an important issue in my life. During the past 2 elections, there was a lot of discussion about the wages of women being 78 cents on the dollar for the same job for a white man. What often isn't said, however, is the wages of Black women was 64 cents on the dollar, and Latinx women was 53 cents on the dollar. Women make up 51% of the American population, but they only make up 19% of the seats in the House and 21% of the seats in the Senate. We rank believe this or not, 100th globally for the percentage of women holding national government positions after Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, not necessarily known for their feminist viewpoints. I think this is partially why the United States is with Swaziland, Lesotho, and Papua New Guinea as the only 4 countries on the face of the earth that don't have mandated paid maternity leave. 4% of Fortune 500 companies are led by women. These are all startling statistics if you didn't know them, but the situation of women globally is even worse. So one of the most powerful books that I ever read is called Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wood, his wife. Kristof is a New York Times columnist. His wife is a prominent author. And the book was about the oppression of women globally and the heroic resistance of some of those women. And it's something I highly recommend to you, but the 2 statistics I want to share with you today are these: that more women and girls have died in the last 50 years simply because they were a woman or a girl than all of the soldiers who died in all of the wars of the 20th century combined. That more women and girls were murdered because they were a woman or a girl in acts of gendercide in the 20th century than all of the people who died in acts of genocide in the 20th century combined. Every morning I wake up and I think of the 32 million school-age girls who won't go to school that day because it's against the custom or law of that land for that girl to get an education. It's why this now woman, then wonder child, Malala, won the Nobel Peace Prize several years ago, because she literally risked her life so other girls in her village could get an education. Women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44 are more likely to die or be maimed by an act of male violence than because of cancer, malaria, war, and traffic accidents combined. Millions of girls and women are sold into human trafficking, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. 100,000 girls under the age of 12 are sold as child brides every year, never to see their parents again. And more than 100 million women and girls globally have experienced female genital mutilation. If you don't know what that is, it's a surgical procedure on the female genitalia for non-medical reasons. 100 million girls and women have experienced it globally. Former President Jimmy Carter called the abuse of women and girls the worst human rights abuse on earth right now in his book, A Call to Action. I don't know if it's the worst, but it's certainly among the worst. So I also listen to older people. I'm a person who I'm rarely angry. I think up until the election in 2016, I'd probably been angry 4 or 5 times in my life. I spent 4 years being angry during the last presidential tenure of Donald Trump, but that's a different story. But in 2005, I was angry when no state, local, and federal government responded to the people of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. 6 days after the storm hit, 100,000 Black people, poor people who had come from low-income areas, were in the convention center in the Superdome, stranded in the worst hurricane in American history up to that point. It was only when Wolf Blitzer started putting split screen images of what FEMA said was going on and what was actually going on the screens that we began to have trucks and buses and boats come in to bring those people out. I don't have any doubt if those were 100,000 white people in the convention center in the Superdome, they would have been out by Monday afternoon, but they were not all white people. So I went down there a year later with the Orlando Magic. And at the end of the second day, we're in Baton Rouge providing resources to people who had now been moved out of New Orleans. And I was talking to the pastor of the church. It was the church that you saw on television if you were following it on the news. And Alex Martin's the president of the Magic. And I couldn't help but see a long line of people getting up to talk to a woman who was sitting in the middle of a wall not too far from me. And I asked the minister who she was, and he said her name is Ida Johnson. She's 106 years old, and that she was surrounded by 5 cots of what looked like 5 nuclear African-American families. He said those are 5 generations of her family around her side. So I went up to Ms. Johnson, and to this day, I don't know what I said to her. I joined the long line of people. I didn't want to overtax her. So I said something fairly simple and short, and this is what Ms. Johnson said to me. Now she knows, we all know at this point, that every habitable structure in the lower 9th Ward was no longer habitable. 14 feet of water sat in the basin of the lower 9th Ward, which is where most of the African-American people lived. She knew that none of her family had a house to go back to. This is what she said: God is good. I'm like, How can you have that perspective at this particular time? And because of Miss Johnson and what I was seeing, I decided that I had to do something about it. And together with our students and in the DeVos Sport Business Management Program and athletes around the country and my own daughter and wife, we've now spent 58 weeks in New Orleans since 2006 rebuilding homes. We worked on 158 different homes during that period of time. Of all the things I've been involved with, it's been the most meaningful of my life because I listened to Ms. Johnson that day. I listened to younger people. So our daughter Emily came home when she was a sophomore in college at Eckerd College and started talking about a course she was taking on human trafficking and began to educate us on human trafficking. She said, that's what I want to spend my life doing. So when she graduated, she went to work at UNICEF and started UNICEF's program on human trafficking and became its director. And we formed a partnership with them and held programs on 41 college campuses over 4 years. Our hope was we'd see about 1,000 students a year and people would come out to learn more about human trafficking. But because we used the sports platform to do it, more than 74,000 people came out to hear us in the next 4 years. Again, because I was listening to this younger, powerful daughter of mine. I listened to Muslims as anti-Muslim feelings escalated at various points around the country. I'm lucky enough that two of my closest friends were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and was Muhammad Ali. And whenever those feelings rose to the surface, both of them got up and said that this is not my religion, that this is a slice of Islam that has nothing to do with what Islam is really about. It's a religion of peace. Our children are confronting so many social justice issues that we have to face. When Barack Obama became president, there were 625 hate groups. When he left office, there were 950 hate groups. When Trump left office, there were 1,200 hate groups. Our children have learned how to hate. They're also waging war on one another. I told you earlier that 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound every day. 400,000 high school students are taken to emergency rooms every year, according to the CDC, because of a violent act that took place on high school property during high school hours. 400,000 people. Our children are waging war on one another. The dropout rate of urban schools in America is 40%. 2,000 children go missing every day. It's the wealth gap is what I want to talk mostly about because it affects everything else that we're talking about in the racial reckoning. The Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, those 400 people have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. How is that possible? I want to say that again. The 400 wealthiest Americans have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. What that translates to is if you're in the top 10% of income earners in the United States, you're going to live 14 years longer on average than if you're in the bottom 10%. The Black infant mortality rate, I'm sure you know, is twice that of white babies. We've read so many stories during COVID about the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and brown communities and on Native American communities. We represent 5% of the world's population. We represent 25% of the world's prison population in the United States. They're mostly brown and Black. They mostly have committed crimes that won't be on the books in a few years as minor drug offenses are taken away. And people will tell me when I talk about this in criminal justice reform, some people will sometimes say that, yeah, but they'll get out after a few years and they can have a normal life again. It's not that easy. They're not entitled to any federal assistance. They can't vote. They have, you go for a job with a felony conviction and the employer says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? That's likely to be the end of the discussion. In this country, 1.3 million American women are battered every year. 900,000 are raped every year. 34% of teenage girls have a child before they reach the age of 20. 34%. And when researchers ask them, why did you risk completing your education and possibly getting the career path that you wanted to? 1% will go to college of those girls, 3% will finish high school. The almost universal response those girls give is, I wanted somebody to love me. They didn't feel loved at that point in their life, so they brought this new life into the world. We're the biggest consumers of drugs in the world. The biggest consumers of drugs in America are people under the age of 25. Why do you take a drug? Presumably you take it because you think you feel better with it than without it. Reports of child abuse in the United States are made every 10 seconds. every 10 seconds is a report of child abuse. 1 in 10 are reported. Human trafficking, I told you I was going to talk a little bit more about. So as somebody who has a PhD in international race relations, I studied the Atlantic slave trade, 240-year period of time. 10 million Africans were enslaved in the Americas. 8 million Africans were enslaved in Africa. 6 million Africans were enslaved in Asia. In other words, over 240 years, aside from the 10 million people who actually died in the slave trade, 24 million human slaves lived during that 240-year period. It's estimated today that between 28 and 32 million human slaves exist around the globe in various forms of human trafficking, the best known of which, of course, is sex trafficking. There are more than half of them are girls and women. And if a child is brought into the sex trade in the United States, the average age in the United States is 12. She's going to have sex 10 times a day, 365 days a year. If somehow she became freed by the time she reached the age of 16, which isn't likely, it's more likely she'd die, or could be he, of HIV/AIDS, or be killed by their pimp if they tried to escape. They would have been raped 14,000 times. This is so hard to fathom. It's something that we just have to mount a tremendous battle against. We talk about sports being a big business in the sports business program that I'm working with at UCF, and it is big business. The 67 pro leagues net annually $62.5 billion. Human trafficking nets annually $150 billion, 2.5 times what all 67 pro leagues net around the globe. If this is a typical hour that we're going to spend here this afternoon, this is what would have happened in America. 138 children dropped out of school, 46 high school students were victimized by violence. A child under the age of 16 was likely killed by a handgun. 83 children were reported missing. 46 babies were born to a teenage mother. 3,600 children were abused. 516 women or girls were battered. 104 were raped. 114 were enslaved during this hour that we're spending here this afternoon. I don't have any doubt that if there are more women and people of color running our country, running our corporations, running our institutions of higher education, running faith-based America, that we'd be addressing these social justice issues instead of the ones that Washington has historically has focused on. I wanted to be with you today because I know that in this audience are leaders that are devoting parts of their lives to addressing these social justice issues. And I'm so grateful to you for doing that. And I want to leave you with a story about a man called Eddie Robinson. He's from my world. Football coach, Grambling State University for 57 years. Won more games than any other coach in the history of college football. Sent more players to the pros than any other coach in the history of college football. Had a graduation of around 80% in an era when it hovered around 50% for college football players. Never had a player get in trouble with the law until his 57th year. I was lucky enough to be asked to co-author his autobiography. We became friends. When he passed in 2007, his wife, Doris, who was also a friend, asked me to deliver part of the eulogy. 10,500 people in the Grambling Convocation Center. There were 9 of us who spoke. And the person who spoke before me was named Willie Davis. He was one of his great players. He's now one of the wealthiest African-American entrepreneurs in the country, won a bunch of Super Bowls with the Green Bay Packers. And Willie Davis got up and said, "I'd like all of Coach Robinson's former players to stand up." It's a sight I'll never forget. 2,400 men stood up, players from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, came to this place that was hard to get to. It's in deep rural Louisiana, is where Grambling State is. Came there so that one more time they could thank Coach Robinson for whatever they felt he had done for them in their lifetime. It's made me think that day and every day since then, when it's my time, who's going to come? What will I have done to have made a difference? And to the audiences I'm lucky to speak to ask people in those audiences, who's going to come when it's your time? What will you have done to make their life better? Many years ago, I was asked what I would like to be written on my tombstone in an icebreaker exercise when I first started getting involved with diversity in education in 1970. And I wrote the following things. I've added a few of these since then, but I would say 70% are what I wrote down that day. You didn't have to be Jewish to want to fight against anti-Semitism. You didn't have to be a person of color to want to fight against racism. You didn't have to be a woman to want to fight against sexism. You didn't have to be from the LGBTQ community to want to fight against homophobia. You didn't have to have a disability to want to fight for those who do have a disability. You didn't have to be poor to want to fight against poverty. You didn't have to be a refugee or an immigrant to fight against xenophobia. He understood that we're all cut from the same human fabric. If leaders have embraced diversity and inclusion, and if our children have learned how to hate each other, we can teach them how to love again. If we embrace diversity and inclusion, we can give our children the tools to make peace. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon. Thank you for what you do in your lives to make this a better world.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Lapchick, for such a wonderful and insightful presentation. And again, we do apologize for the inconvenience earlier. Our tech team was able to fix the issue with the video. Would you like for us to play it at this time?
No, you don't have to do that.
Okay, so we will begin with our question and answer session, and we do have some questions for you. All right, so our first question is, sometimes researchers get caught up in the know and less of the do. How can researchers improve their application of the know and do perspective?
Well, when I saw the subject, it reminded me of something I tell audiences, which is that everybody can't be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines, including researchers that have developed information that could be valuable to helping us fight against racism or fight against whatever it is that is the issue that's important to us. I think that I was blessed that when I went to graduate school, I had 3 professors who were political activists. This was the late 1960s when, the height of the civil rights movement, as well as the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. And they showed me that you could be an academic and also be an activist. And that's the lesson I've taken in my life. And I would suggest to those researchers, that they can volunteer for organizations if they can raise their voices, if they feel up to participating in demonstrations in the streets when something's happening. And 27 million people did last year. It's the largest mass movement of people in demonstrations in the history of the United States. And, one of the things that I would also say, if you happen to be a white researcher, to study more about the issues that are at hand and to talk about them, to listen to Black people, to listen to brown people, to listen to people of color, or whatever issue you're talking about, learn more about it, raise your voice, volunteer, demonstrate if you can. As somebody who's led anti-racist organizations for more than 50 years now, other than being out there in the streets and being active, the hardest thing has always been to do is to raise money for anti-racist organizations. I think that changed this year during the racial reckoning, but if you have the ability to donate to those organizations, I can assure you that those would be very welcome by the organization. So whatever role you feel you're capable of playing, just get involved and use that knowledge that you gained during your research to help society better itself.
Wow, so powerful. All right, so we do have a question in the chat. How do you approach How do you approach white fragility to help others speak up and speak out against racism?
Could you repeat the beginning of it? How do you approach white fragility?
Yes, to help others speak up and speak out against racism.
I urge audiences and I speak, it's been amazing what Zoom has allowed. I normally give about 75 presentations a year around the country. I probably doubled that during the racial reckoning because these Zoom platforms allow you to give multiple presentations. And I know that there are people in those audiences who fit that description. And I, strongly urge them to learn more about the issues, to not be in denial about how powerful a force racism is in this country and white supremacy, and to know that they can play a role as an ally in the struggle against racism, or, if it's about sexism or whatever it's about, that, you can be an ally. It's why I read those tombstone engravings that I envisioned some 50 years ago, because we don't have to come from whatever the group is we want to support and help and be an ally with. But everybody needs to be involved some way, one way or another. And I think America has been woke during this racial reckoning period more than I've ever seen it before. And I don't have any doubt that people who are millennials and Generation Z have a bigger social conscience than previous generations. So they're going to be more active. I think that, they have the technology. We watched the murder of George Floyd so many times because somebody captured it on, some courageous young woman captured it on her smartphone. And we see that in cases around the country regularly now. The police can no longer deny what is captured on video. We have social media to spread communications more rapidly than we've ever had before. As I said earlier, I think people are listening to each other. I think white people are not only thinking, yeah, there's racism here, but are actually listening to Black people about what racism does to them. And I want to say what I should have said earlier, that when I was attacked in 1978, and even to this day, people often come up to me and say, well, you really know what it's like to be Black. And my response to them is, I don't know what it's like to be Black. I could leave what I'm doing on any given day or at any time and resume or start to lead a normal, comfortable white lifestyle, never to face discrimination, never to face violence again. But if I was Black, I'd be Black the next day, and I would face that discrimination and violence every day that I woke up. Hopefully it would never happen, but we all know that if you're a person of color, that there's a possibility that that's going to happen.
Dr. Lapchick, thank you for sharing all of this with us. You have illustrated many incredible examples of the power and permeation of racism within our society. From your experience, what is the best advice you can give to us seeking to learn and understand more deeply the complex, often covered up connections of racism to all systems? Well,
what I'd like to answer that by giving a sign of encouragement, because I know that hearing a lot of the statistics and facts that I shared with you today can be overwhelming and depressing. But on May 10th of 1994, I stood on the steps of the Union buildings in South Africa as Nelson Mandela's guest to watch him become inaugurated. And this was a case where, as I said earlier, South Africa was the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century, as everybody knows. Mandela was the most hated person by that white power structure, 27 years as a political prisoner, and suddenly he became its president. If that can happen, then anything and everything is possible. So all those social justice issues that I talked about earlier, that you're can talk about throughout the day, are addressable, can be, progress can be made on them, but it's going to take that systematic effort and sustained effort. It can't be 1 or 2 years, as sometimes has happened with horrible things that happened in the civil rights movement previously. But I think, as I said earlier, and I tried to paint this as being a different period of time because of the factors I outlined a second ago, that we have a chance to make America be what it supposedly is, and that is a democratic country where everybody is equal.
Okay. Several of those in attendance are or will be educators at the college level. What are your top suggestions for incorporating a social justice lens into all of the courses we teach to impact the doing of our future leaders?
I would find out from the people in the classroom that what they're interested in, and bring materials that target them so they can become advocates for the other students who might not be interested, as well as you as the professor in the class, encouraging that activism and social justice issues, and to try to bring as many people in your class in as partners. Obviously, there's a limit to what you can do as a professor that way, but I think especially if you let, and I try always to let my students talk about the issues themselves and not offer my own opinion, because when they can come to the conclusion, and I think the fight against racism is such an obvious conclusion, when they can come to it themselves as opposed to it being imposed on them by a professor, that they're going to become much more effective as activists.
If you have held conversations with formerly racist and generally hateful individuals, what have you noticed to be the greatest factors or influences in their conversation?
Well, I think the tone has changed. I think that Donald Trump emblazoned white supremacists and extremist groups around the country to feel that they can do anything. After what I experienced in terms of physical assault and dealing with the police decades ago, I think anybody who's involved gets a lot of hate mail. I get that routinely. We publish a lot of reports on racism, especially in the world of sport. But now the tone of those communications is different. I can feel that white supremacy in the tone of what's being written in a threatening way. And I'm much more careful for the first time in a long time where I am, who I'm with, looking around and being, making sure that I'm in a situation where I'm not vulnerable to some of these racists. But when I'm in conversations with them, I try to let them talk things through and to see, and maybe to point to some examples that would contradict where their racism is coming from and whatever their fundamental beliefs are, to try to give them a real picture of what the effects of racism is on communities of color in America.
Dr. Lapchick, you exemplify the role of allyship. Can you share more on the role of bystanders and ways for people to step in the gap?
So the gender violence prevention program that I mentioned that we started in 1992 is based on a bystander program, bystander intervention in a safe way. Bystander intervention in gender violence has now become the kind of accepted way to approach gender violence prevention. And I think the same thing can be done here and in all forms of where things are not equal, such as in racism or sexism. And that's what I said earlier when I said that, everybody can't go out in the streets and demonstrate, but you can volunteer for an organization, support an organization financially, learn more yourself, read. There's so much good literature out there on the things we're talking about here that you can learn more and be better educated on the subject, so you're prepared to have those discussions when you are engaged.
All right. Given your history and experiences, what system changes do you think need to be made moving forward that would enact sustainable changes?
Well, there are so many areas that spin off of that nightmare of the wealth gap that I talked about earlier. But I think we have to address education as a primary area, healthcare as a primary area. I can't tell you how many times I read about or have experience with friends who are Black who went to hospitals with their wife for some form of treatment that would routinely be able to be treated. And the hospital and that Black community did not have the equipment or the doctors available to treat it. And that I know 2 women who lost their lives as a result of that, simply because it wasn't available in that hospital. 2 miles away at a predominantly white hospital, it was available. Then there's, of course, housing. What kind of shelter do we have? What kind of access do we have to financial resources? Our banking system in the country and financial parts of the financial empire in the country have been, the term redlining has been all too commonly used because it's been all too common. Those monies are made accessible to white communities and not to communities of color in anywhere near the proportion. And then again, the whole area of the criminal justice system. We happen to have a local citizen here who's become one of my heroes, and I hope that people in the audience know Desmond Meade. Desmond Meade was, if you don't know who he was, please learn about him. He was, as a teenager, a drug addict. He committed crimes as a teenager, went to prison. While he was in prison, he educated himself, ended up getting a law degree. When he came out, he went to register for the bar in Florida and was told that somebody who was a felon could not register for the bar. And then when he went to register to vote, he found out he couldn't vote. So in 2018, he led a movement in Florida. Now, this is Florida of Governor DeSantis. This is Florida of Rick Scott. This is Florida that just passed a law basically against demonstrating in ways that most people demonstrate. He got the 67% of the residents of Florida to vote that a former, he calls them returning citizens, but an ex-felon who's released from prison can get their vote back. And that's 1.5 million people. So Governor DeSantis quickly got legislation passed through as that voting bloc was threatening to turn the tide to a Democratic vote in Florida, and said that, yes, they can vote, but they have to pay their fines that they owe from their court cases or any legal fees that they have outstanding, so that then they couldn't vote. So Desmond Meade began to raise money. This is one guy, and he raised $25 million to pay those fines so that more than 45,000 of those returning citizens, as he calls them, could vote. There are Desmond Meades that we don't know about that we can help and support and get them to become that full-blown human being who's having such an impact on our country.
Right. We would like to close this Q&A with a comment by Dr. Malcolm Butler. Dr. Lapchick has walked the walk with sincerity of heart that is much needed today. Each of us can find a place in pushing towards the ideal of democracy. Again, we thank you, Dr. Lapchick, for your time today and for a powerful presentation. All right, I will now pass it on to Erica.
Thank you again.
If you're like me, you've taken some great notes and are filled with confidence and conviction that we can all do more. We are very pleased to present our first panelist for this session. Reverend Dr. James T. Morris is a spiritual leader, pastor, residing elder, past school principal, dean, historian, and former member of the State House of Representatives in Missouri. Since his arrival here in 2014, he began to ponder between the impact of racial segregation and uneven economic development presented in the United States as a whole. His research led him to a city called Paramore, a proud neighborhood divided through disruptions due to the construction of public housing and interstate highways. He was and still is able to make an impact. He hosts a weekly podcast called Morris Monday, where he offers steering commentary on the issues of the day. For his presentation today, we asked that he share thoughts regarding land rights. Let's all welcome Reverend Dr. James T. Morris.
Thank you and good afternoon. Let me first say thank you to Dr. Martha S. Lou Stewart, who is a member of the Carter Tabernacle Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, where I have the pleasure of being the senior pastor. Dr. Lou is not only a faithful member, but our church historian, and we're delighted that she asked me to be a part of this forum this afternoon. I also have to say thank you to Dr. Lapchick, because he has been an inspiration to me for several years, and I appreciate his thoughtful presentation, and I love his book. The one that I most enjoy is the one on American racism in sports, and I think the title of that is Broken Promises. But thank you, Dr. Lapchick, for your presentation today. My responsibility is to talk with you today about the correlation between land, or the lack thereof, in the problems that are facing Black communities across this nation, and more specifically, the Paramore area here in Orlando. So we'll get started now because I'm on a time limit and I'm a Black preacher, and so I'm working here under some constraints, but we're delighted to be with you and to share. The Paramore Holden area, more specifically Paramore, is one of Orlando's historically Black communities that was once a thriving Black middle-class community. What Harlem was to New York, Paramore was to Orlando. There, the city's Black culture was nourished and developed. It also thrived economically for Black businesses of all types. Paramore is made up of 3 neighborhoods: Lake Dot, Callahan, and the Holden Paramore neighborhoods. Established in 1881 by James B. Paramore, a white Confederate soldier and ex-mayor of Orlando, who said in his own words that Paramore was established to, and I quote, house the Blacks employed in the households of white Orlandoans. Paramore is bordered on the east by Division Street and west by Orange Blossom Trail, Gore Street to the south, and Washington Street to the north. Division Street marks the line where African Americans here in Orlando could not be caught crossing after sundown during the Jim Crow era. And today, Griffin Park, a federal housing project, is completely boxed in by Interstate 4 and State Road 408, subjecting those who live there to air pollution from upwards of 300,000 cars and trucks a day. Presently, just east of Division Street is the city's commerce, government, banking, and booming health industries. To add insult to injury, many Black-owned homes and properties were annexed or taken over by eminent domain by the city to erect a basketball arena and more recently a soccer stadium, both displacing hundreds of homes and numerous Black businesses. The creation of these venues and other land grabs by white owners and developers have led to the steady decline and the demise of Paramore. Home ownership in an area once thriving with Black middle-class families, business persons, and entrepreneurs of every stripe has decreased exponentially, creating serious gaps in land and home ownership in the Paramore area. Nationwide, land under Black ownership has steadily declined over the last 100 years, and Orlando is no exception to this fact. In 2017, the racial home ownership gap was at its highest levels in more than 50 years. The statistics are that 79.1% of whites own homes, while 41.8% of Blacks own homes. Here in Orlando, this fact is crucial to our understanding the crippling economic disparity that has led to the elimination of a Black middle class in communities across this nation like Paramore, thus making it harder and almost next to impossible for those generation of Blacks to accrue wealth and or pass it on to their children. This has meant the continued demise of historic Black family structures of community and stabilized Black neighborhoods. In addition, Paramore suffered because of the urban transformation that occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when business and policymakers focused on developing suburbs as a way for whites to avoid the urban plight and crime they had created in neighborhoods like Paramore. So massive road projects that became the 408 or the East-West Expressway and I-4 were developed for commerce, travel, and white flight to the suburbs. I-4 alone destroyed and displaced some 551 properties and families. Likewise, the construction of 408 did the same thing in 1973. These major roadways were developed by taking Black-owned land and houses, thus forcing Blacks in Paramore to live in federal housing projects like Griffin Park, mentioned earlier, or to find other areas in which to live. The I-4 project did something else. It created a gigantic concrete division between Paramore and downtown Orlando, a race and class barrier that is impossible to overlook here in Orlando. The construction of these highways proceeded without consideration of the adverse effects upon Paramore, the likes of which are still problems today. Subsequently, Orlando is the ongoing subject of an EPA investigation into the unsustainable air quality engulfing the Paramore community because of the exhaust by more than 300 cars a day that travel on I-4 and 408. And then to add insult to injury, the trees that could have been a natural barrier to noxious fumes from the cars and the trucks that travel those two highways have been removed. This only exacerbates the EPA's findings that African Americans are exposed to 1.54 times more air pollution than whites, resulting in higher incidences of lung ailments and heart disease. No wonder the median household income for a family of 4 in Paramore is now $13,613. That's the median household income, $13,613. And childhood poverty is subsequently 73%. Systemically, income inequality has increased, and there is alarming disparity between the unemployment rate in Orlando and Paramore. You see, land ownership is important to any people because it's a type of wealth that people benefit from and can pass down to future generations. Slavery and resulting issues kept Black people from attaining wealth by and large. Following slavery, laws were established to ensure that this practice continued. The same attempt at denying property, wealth, and ownership is accomplished today by redlining Black neighborhoods. This has contributed significantly to the steady downward trajectory of Black wealth. The FHA was instrumental in doing 3 things detrimental to African Americans from my window. 1, it helped establish the suburbs that white middle and upper middle class families flocked to, creating white flight. Secondly, it locked African Americans out of the qualifying process by creating the practice that deemed whole neighborhoods off limits to normal lending practices. And that's the redlining again. Thirdly, it forced African Americans into the clutches of predatory lenders, even when their credit scores were similar or equal to whites. And this is a practice still very much alive today, which steadily contributes to the decline in Black wealth. The precipitous slide toward disenfranchisement and land loss is still unabated today. This is not simply a regrettable piece of American history, but a reminder of current systematic racial practices still employed right here in Orlando. Since the 1960s, the ever increasing rate of poverty among African Americans has been an issue this country has openly wrestled with. Prior to the 60s, it was not a national issue. It was given of how things were. Nothing to talk about. That's just the way things were. And in the absence of serious qualified numeric statistics, it was felt and believed that Black poverty was a product of laziness, bad choices, and divine misfortune. Scholarly scientific data has proven that Black poverty is a direct correlation between racist policies and ignorance on the part of many whites. Black poverty is not a sign of Black dysfunction or pathology, but the result of living with few to no opportunities. It is a legacy of structural inequality that has systematically led to Black land loss or hindrances to land acquisition, which has caused the lack of health and basic human services in communities like Paramore. Recent studies have proven that low tax generating communities has resulted in a lack of health and human services in those same communities. It is clear, crystal clear, that the social conditions under which high needs communities are forced to exist and the health behaviors that flow from such conditions are directly linked to poverty, which in turn has profound impact on the health and general well-being of communities like Paramore. Subsequently, studies have shown that poor Blacks live on average 7 to 15 years less than whites. And even more startling, they can anticipate dying 10 to 15 years earlier than those who live in nearby communities with greater wealth. These statistics alone make it abundantly clear that access to health care and broadened human services are not sufficient to eliminate high need communities. There must be a transformation of healthcare and human services as a way of sufficiently addressing the inequalities and the inequities. This can be accomplished by a real partnership between federal, state, and local entities. I believe federal, state, and local governments can provide the essential foundation for creating healthy communities. This has been proven by our handling of childcare and early childhood education. Because of these partnerships, we've begun to turn the corner. Social science data and neurobiological findings have highlighted the benefits of early intervention programs like Head Start and other child care subsidies in a child's life. These subsidies are necessary, vital to the growth and development of underserved communities. It leads to improved educational success, good social behaviors, future employment, higher income, better neighborhoods, improved health, and the list goes on. I'd like to say that in his book entitled The Beloved Community, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about the need to create community, redemption, and reconciliation among all peoples, regardless of race, education, or economic capacity. It was a community where all are created as equal and all have the same access to life, liberty, and the pursuits of happiness. The kind of fellowship and community that could only be realized between free and equal human beings who have a mutual respect for one another. The scope of King's beloved community is broad and encompasses a variety of different programs that have as their goal the protection of high need communities from harms such as income inequality, housing instability, job insecurity, unequal access to goods and services, inadequate educational systems, and food insecurity. Dr. King's beloved community also sought to help people provide for themselves, thrive, and contribute to society. I believe we can still have the beloved community, and we can accomplish this by federal, state, and local partnerships that connect high needs communities with programs streamlining eligibility, addressing barriers to access. Barriers to access must be addressed, and making sure programs operate in ways that affirm rather than detract from human dignity, and coordination among programs whereby individuals who qualify for programs receive other services that enhance economic mobility and health. Finally, as a Black preacher will say, the work of transforming communities like Paramore into places where residents can thrive won't be easy and will be complicated. Yet these policies will be necessary if our city, state, and nation are to experience a more positive future than we are experiencing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Morris, for such an informative presentation. A few days ago, upon learning the outcome of a well-publicized case, panelist, attorney, registered pharmacist, civic engagement activist, and blogger, Dr. Butler penned the following. Darnella Frazier was just 17 years old when she took out her cell phone and filmed George Floyd being murdered by Officer Derek Chauvin. She later testified against Chauvin during his trial. Darnella Frazier is what courage looks like. Another entry penned by Dr. Butler stated, "Dear white supremacists and racists, there are a lot of guns and bullets in America, but there aren't enough guns and bullets to kill all of the people in America who don't look and think like you. You might as well learn to live with the rest of us. Hashtag Stop Asian Hate." We can learn from her pieces the importance of empathizing with others, and that just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it won't. As a graduate from the highly regarded pharmacy program at FAMU, while aptly equipped with Juris Doctorate from the FAMU College of Law, writing runs in her veins. She is a native Central Floridian with great anticipation that we await what she has penned. A mentor, a thought leader, and strives to make the space a better place. When and where she enters, she is one of the unheralded social justice and equity warriors here in Central Florida. We are delighted that she could arrange her busy schedule to join us this afternoon. Let's all welcome Dr. Butler.
Dr. Butler, please check your microphone and make sure you are unmuted.
Yes, I am.
There we go. We can hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Slanda, Dr. Marty Lou Stewart, and the PhD candidates for putting together such a wonderful program. And I'd like to say how honored I am to have worked, have been able to hear and work on the panel with Dr. Lapchick. I followed him on Twitter for several years, and he gave a wonderful presentation, and he's an amazing man. As I was introduced, I'm been pinned by Dr. Lou Stewart as a social media community engagement activist blogger. Well, I do speak in the community, and I mentor. Yeah. And I mentor as well. So, but I engage mostly on social media, informing my followers about voting bills, Congress, and actions that can be taken to combat whatever ills that are proposed. I also like to talk about sports and music. So I like to say that I am a multilingual person that's fluid in politics, sports, and music. I also speak the Queen's English and Ebonics. I grew up in Orlando, very interested in politics most of my life. It's what I always heard around my house. My parents were very interested in politics. My mother taught history at Valencia, and my father was also an educator. My parents were also in organizations that registered voters. So as a child, I always knew the importance of voting. During my school years, I was a participant in student government. And during my high school years, I led a school walkout at Jones High School. And we marched to the Orange County School Board, who was considering closing some of the schools in Orange County. And we wanted to make sure that Jones High School was not one of them. While at FAMU, I was also in student government. And on the day of the Chauvin verdict, I called my nephew to see how he was doing emotionally. And I shared with him that I had been protesting and marching against police brutality since I was a student at FAMU, when a former Marine, Arthur McDuffie, who was an insurance man in Miami, was brutally beat to death by Miami police officers who were acquitted. That was 1980. And this was the first time in my life I had ever seen a white officer be convicted of killing a Black man. I knew early on that the only way to make change was to participate in making the change. When I came home from FAMU, I mentored young ladies, and I was introduced by my sister to a lady who was gracious enough to let me be a senior advisor on her campaign for city commissioner. I will always be grateful to her, to Daisy Lynham, former city commissioner Daisy Lynham. So as I worked on campaigns, I've worked on many presidential campaigns, registered voters, and encouraged everyone I know and don't know to register to vote and to vote. I use my social media platforms to talk about civic engagement, sports, music, but mostly civic engagement. I believe that it's all in being a part of a good citizen. So I'd like to speak with you mostly today about what it takes to be a good citizen. Like I told you, I'm a sports fan, so I always talk about sports too. But I'm not sure if any of y'all have seen this game, but back in 2019, an NBA game, the Oklahoma City Thunder was playing the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Timberwolves had a 2-point lead with 1.1 seconds left, with their center, Karl Anthony Towns, at the free throw line. Now the game was over, at least that's what everybody thought. but Towns missed the first free throw. And instead of missing the second one, Minnesota called a timeout and substituted their player Jordan Bell in the game. Now, he stepped on the floor with his jersey untucked. Chris Paul, who was the all-star point guard for the Oklahoma City Thunder, alerted the referees to this infraction and told them they needed to call a delay of game violation. The refs did, and because it was the Timberwolves' second delay of game, Oklahoma City got to shoot a free throw. Their player made the free throw. Minnesota was only up by 1 point. Towns made the second free throw, and they were up by 2 points. Oklahoma City got the ball. Their center inbounded the ball through a perfect pass to Dennis Schroeder, who hit a shot at the buzzer that tied the game. They went into overtime, and Oklahoma City won the game. The miracle comeback happened because Chris Paul knew the rules. Now, during Barack Obama's first campaign for Illinois State Senate, in Illinois, the candidates for state office must file nominating petitions. They have to have enough signatures to show that they have enough support to be put on the ballot. So once they got all of the petitions in, the candidates are permitted to file challenges to those signatures and to those petitions. There were 6 people running, and Obama filed objections against 4 of the 6 candidates in the race that would have been in the race. He got all 4 of them eliminated from the ballot, and he won the race. Had Barack Obama not known the rules, he more than likely would have lost that race because all of those 4 candidates were much more popular than he was. Had he lost that race, we probably would not have seen history made on November 4th, 2008. Why did I choose those 2 stories? Just to show you how important it is to know the rules before you enter the game. Will you always win when you know the rules? Not always. But if you know them, but if you don't know them, you're probably guaranteed to lose. Now, I spend time on social media a lot, and I love to read comments, although that's supposed to be a no-no. And I'm shocked by the number of people that actually talk about government and politics, but don't actually know how government and politics works. But and most people hate politics, but politics is involved in everything we do. So it's important to know how government works. Government determines where the crosswalk and the stoplight is located in our city streets, where your child attends school, the minimum wage of hourly workers, and what programs are funded in our cities and in our neighborhoods. And we always talk about registering to vote. You always hear during election time, before election, you got to register to vote, you got to register to vote, you got to vote. But do we really know how to vote and what comes after voting? First, you vote the entire ballot. You don't just vote for the president and walk out. And you vote for in every city and local election, we must vote. We must educate ourselves on the issues. And it's important to vote for the president of the United States. But the most important issues are the everyday issues that affect us. And those are state and local issues. The mayor, state attorney, school board members, and county and city commissioners. Now, the first thing I'd like to touch on is voting in every election. In every local election, it's important to elect knowledgeable servant leaders. And let me clarify what I mean when I say knowledgeable. You don't have to have a PhD to run for office. I mean knowledgeable and have a passion for the issues that will affect the people that you're going to represent. In addition to being knowledgeable, you also have to have solutions to those problems that you see around, that those things that make you want to run for office. And I mean, make sure you elect people that have solutions, not just complainers. And when those people have those solutions, make sure that they are formulated from the ideas of the people that you represent. You talk to the people in your neighborhoods, talk to the people in the district to see what their issues are and see how they can best solve the issues. I think it's important to have servant leaders. And when I say servant leaders, I mean candidates who keep the people at the forefront of their decisions, not those people that use consultants, but people that are authentic and people that are well focused on children's issues. It's important that we take care of our children. And I mean all children. When you go, and one thing that we can also teach our children is the importance of voting when they're children. So when you go to vote, make sure you take your child with you. If you vote by mail, when you sit down to fill out your ballot, sit your child down with you and go over the ballot with them. When you learn how to do things as children, they kind of stick with you. I think it's important that we attend school board meetings, city council meetings, county commission meetings, that we write, call, email our elected officials and let your voices be heard. Too often, we put our elected officials on a pedestal when actually we're the employers, they're the employees. Form really good relationships with your elected officials. Call their offices. Tell them when you see something you don't like. Tell them when you see something that you like that they've done. Hold them accountable for what they do and for what they don't do. But we always must commend them when they do a good job. It's important also to complete a census form. I understand that the census deadline has passed now, but let's just talk about it for a second. Every 10 years, there's a census. When you fill out your census form, it actually determines the federal funding for the various programs in your federal programs in your congressional district. It also determines how many Congress members are awarded to your state every 10 years. This is a biggie for me, this next one. Jury duty. Everybody tries to get out of jury duty because you hate sitting in there for such a long time and you might or you might not get caught. But please do not try to get out of jury duty the next time that you're called. You have seen by the various verdicts that have come down that juries need to have defendants need to have a jury of their peers. It's important that we serve on juries. It's one of the most important things we can do. And I encourage the leaders. I know there's so many leaders that are on this Zoom call. So I would encourage you to run for office as well. I would also encourage you to volunteer with organizations like the NAACP, Color of Change. Start a Black Lives Matter chapter in your city. These are all important organizations. Mentor or ask to be mentored by a local elected official. The city, state, and country needs your voices. We also need your ideas. And lastly, understand that the work is never done. With every victory, the next go round, you'll find the goalposts have been moved. But we must be persistent. As I said earlier, you will not always win, and change does not come overnight. But as Coretta Scott King said, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. I encourage you to be persistent, be vigilant, but most of all, remain hopeful. Hope. Hope in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty, the audacity of hope. In the end, that's God's greatest gift to us. That's from Barack Obama. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for such an insightful presentation. You might have read some of his op-eds in a local newspaper as he addressed issues related to students from underserved communities and their families. He most recently published comments on a local media outlet dealing with the differences between how Black and white students are disciplined in the public schools. Dr. Larry Walker, Assistant Professor, Educational Leadership, formerly of Howard University, Legislative Director for former Congressman Major R. Owens, research is identified by 4 threads: traits of successful teachers, recruitment and retention of Black male teachers, impact of environmental factors on Black students, and how federal and state policies impact students and their families from underserved communities. Let's all welcome Dr. Larry Walker.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you and with such an esteemed panel. Let me start by thanking the co-conveners of this important symposium, Dr. Slanda and Dr. Lou Stewart. I believe I heard Dr. Lou Stewart say she was retiring, if I'm not mistaken. And if that's true, it's a huge loss for UCF and you will sorely be missed. And thank you for your years of commitment. Let me also add that it's an honor to essentially share what I would describe as an electronic dais with my UCF colleague, Dr. Lapchick, and also with the Reverend Dr. Morris and Dr. Butler. Thank you for your presentations. They were insightful, and I certainly enjoyed listening to them, and maybe looking forward to collaborating in the near future. So this is an interesting time in America, and I'm sure that could be said for each generation. But in particular, the last 13 months or so have been particularly trying for most Americans, and particularly for members of the Black community. And as you can see there, there's kind of a list of agenda things I want to discuss with you this afternoon. I'm going to talk about do the right thing, and I'm connecting, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to get a little nostalgic and talk about some movies, but I want to connect some of the threads of our discussion today, this idea of doing and knowing, and also connected to some of the challenges we see in our society today. Dr. Lapchick and others alluded to it, and particularly as it relates to what's happening and what has happened historically when it comes to the relationship between law enforcement and in a Black community, particularly, like I said, the deaths, murders, and the Derek Chauvin case of not only Black men, Black women also. Like I said, you see that second bullet point. I'm gonna talk a little bit of tie this thread to some movies over the last several decades. I'm going to talk about a Harvard study as it relates to police brutality and misconduct in the Black community. I'm going to talk about the criminalization of Black males, because this is kind of a key core issue that we need to unpack. And then talk a little bit about what criminalizing Black males looks like in education briefly. And then the doing part, right? Because this theme is knowing and then doing. And then the doing part, like, what do we need to do about some of these challenges? And I'm going to talk about, that last bullet point, as you can see there, what are you prepared to do? So just in general, before we go on to the next slide, before we go into the next slide, as I said, was discussed earlier, the Derek Chauvin verdict, and I'm going to get to that a little bit in a few minutes. But just overall, the United States has, we've been using, I gave a presentation last week and I used this phrase of racial upheaval. But the challenges that the Black community is encountering as it relates to law enforcement, they're not new. And they're certainly not going away anytime soon. But these are issues that we have to confront head on. And if anyone's ever heard me speak or any, op-eds, as was just recently described, I believe in confronting issues related to racism head on. And the reason why I believe that is important is because these challenges are part of my lived experience as a Black male. I have a son, I have nieces and nephews, and I have family members I care about and friends I care about a great deal. So you see that when I discuss these issues related to racism, I'm not an outsider discussing these issues. This is part of my own lived experience. And I think it's important, as I will share some of my lived experiences, but also contextualize it with some research studies that highlight some of the disparities between Blacks and whites, particularly, as I said, when it comes to law enforcement and also how we view Black males. You can go into the next slide. Thank you. So I said a few minutes ago, I get a little nostalgic, but not in a good way. So the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial just this week, some people are seeing as a pivotal moment in U.S. history as it relates to holding police officers responsible. I'm not quite sure I want to go that far in this study that I'm going to talk about just in a few minutes. But the verdict reminded me of a movie some of you remember or have heard of, and if you haven't seen it, for some of you, maybe for different generations, I would recommend you watch Do the Right Thing, which is Spike Lee's powerful movie, which came out in 1989. As you can see, that first bullet point, it was directed by Spike Lee. And so in his second bullet point, it unpacked economics, gentrification, and policing in broken neighborhood. And so when I heard the Derek Chauvin verdict, and I tried to avoid, like I said, I'm trying to do the right thing. I tried to avoid much of the trial because if watching and hearing about it on social media or people text me about it, it was like a daily traumatic experience. And one of the other things I work on relate in my research is race-based trauma. And it has been a agonizing experience, not only when we talk about his death, but also the death of Breonna Taylor. And let me also add that I did watch the verdict. And like I said, I'm going to tie this to Do the Right Thing and then that third bullet point. And after the verdict was read, like a lot of Black males that I know, I cried. And I cried because I was angry. I was angry because George Floyd unnecessarily lost his life. And I was also angry because I know this won't be the last time I'll have to feel the way I'm feeling. I share that with you because I think it's important for people to understand that, while I'm here as a researcher, I am without a doubt a Black male who cares very passionately about what happens in the Black community, particularly the harmful effects of systemic racism. And so I try to speak very plainly about these issues. And then, so once again, as relates to George Floyd in the movie in 1989, Do the Right Thing, one of the characters there is known as Radio Raheem, was murdered by law enforcement. He was choked to death. And similar to George Floyd, members of the community reacted to that. And the reason why I'm highlighting this, and in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about some other similar depictions in movies of the last several decades, is to remind you again, and once again, you can see at the top there, that this movie was came out in 1989. Right. So once again, is to kind of give you a historical context that these issues relating to police brutality, particularly the murders, in this case, talking specifically about Black men, are not new, that these events have occurred for decades and that they have a real impact on communities. So once again, just kind of give you an idea to connecting. If you haven't seen Do the Right Thing, I would recommend it. And like I said, the idea of that character, Radio Raheem, being killed by police officers at the end of the movie, the response by community members, and also the reminder that in terms of how we're dealing with the after effects of the Derek Chauvin murder trial and the impact it has on Black males long term. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, once again, so like I said, that the Derek Chauvin case reminded me of Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing. But to be honest with you, I love movies, but it was some other movies that kind of came to mind to me when it came to the Derek Chauvin trial, and then thinking about mass media, social media, television, movies, social platforms, et cetera, in terms of how the experiences of specifically Black men are conveyed, right? So I have a list here, in addition to Do the Right Thing, which came out in 1989, we have 4 other movies here. So In the Heat of the Night, 1967, The Learning Tree, 69, Boys in the Hood, 91, and Higher Learning in 1995. Now, 3 of the 4 movies here that you see listed were directed by Black men, right? So, and then I forgot about Do the Right Thing. Obviously, Do the Right Thing was directed by Spike Lee. So including that, 4 of the 5 movies were directed by Black men. So for those who are not familiar, let me add, I might have a little gray in my beard, but In the Heat of the Night and Learning Tree, when they came out, I was not around. So just for clarification, but they are classic movies nonetheless. So 1969, Sidney Poitier played a police officer who was in the beginning would be traveling and found himself in Mississippi, and then it was a murder. And essentially someone who was just kind of traveling, moving from one place to another. And Sidney Poitier was stopped and thought to be the one responsible for committing this murder. Come to find out from law enforcement and members of the community is that Sidney Poitier character at that time, the character he was portraying was a well-known homicide detective from Philadelphia. So he helped solve the crime. I'm highlighting Sidney Poitier because we often forget we have a conversation about the rates in which Black people are killed by law enforcement. Is that it's almost a tendency to forget that I know people who are members of law enforcement who are also Black, that we forget that there are Black law enforcement officers. So in this particular movie, as a law enforcement officer, he was in the beginning accused of committing a crime. Right. And so obviously they found out he was a law enforcement officer, but at the same time, he had to come around and it was still do some of the work in solving the crime. Now, once again, that took place in 1967. And we're talking about some of the things we know in terms of depictions in movies that reflect the authentic lived experiences of Black men in America, and not in 2021, but for decades. The next movie there is The Learning Tree. And that movie kind of once again depicted life, and I think at the time it was 1920s in Kansas, and it follows this young teenager, by the name of Newt, and his experiences in this racist town, overtly racist town, and his once again interactions with law enforcement. It also this connection to my later slides in terms of how Black males are treated in school systems. Right, there's a specific moment in the movie in which the way he's treated by a teacher dismissively in terms of looking at what kind of abilities she believes he's had compares to the kind of abilities he actually has. But also there's also an event there in which law enforcement once again takes the life of a Black male. So once again, this theme is consistent through these movies of the challenges that Black men in our society continue to encounter. The next movie, Boys in the Hood, directed by John Singleton. And both those last 2 movies were directed by John Singleton. This is also, I must add, it was an Oscar-nominated movie, and I believe also Do the Right Thing was. Now, in my opinion, both movies should have won the Oscar those years and didn't. But Boys in the Hood, depictions of life in Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles. But also there's a moment in the movie in terms of well, throughout, that theme is throughout, but particularly in terms of how some of the characters are stopped by law enforcement, and then how they're treated. In one instance where a police officer threatens to hurt one of the characters, and of the feeling and the emotions, and he's shedding tears, and because of the way he was treated and the fear that goes along with that. And once again, it's like I said, for you to understand, when we talk about doing the right thing and creating safe pathways, we have to understand and remember that there are a number of challenges that Black males encounter, right? So when it comes to knowing, we know that these things these events occur. And like I said, in a little bit, I'm going to connect it to a study. That last bullet point there is higher learning. Once again, another movie directed by John Singleton, a great movie, takes place on a post-secondary institution, talks about a lot of issues in terms of class. It also obviously talks about racism, and it also talks about gender issues in terms of intimate partner violence as it relates to challenges women have to deal with. But really interesting enough is it kind of culminates in the end of the movie of a white supremacist it's kind of similar we see today in our society in terms of these mass killings. And then when he's committing this crime, a Black male's character, his girlfriend is shot and killed, and he runs up a set of stairs to try to tackle to get this guy. And when he confronts them and they're fighting, law enforcement from on campus enter the building. And instead of grabbing the person responsible for the shooting, they grab the Black male and try to arrest him. And once again, this highlights in terms of the disparities in terms of how groups are treated when it comes to law enforcement. And obviously, this is also when it comes to place when we talk about on not just outside of post-secondary institutions, but on our own campuses, that we have to confront these challenges that Black males have to deal with on a continuous basis. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a study that was conducted by two researchers, two doctoral students at Harvard University, came out last summer. And let me be clear, this is not the first, nor will be the last study that looked at the race in which, members of the Black community came in contact with law enforcement, and how, in terms of, in some cases, the murder of Black residents sometimes. But this study, it looked at data from 2013 to 17 there, and it was a little bit different than some other studies, and that it looked at metropolitan areas. And I would certainly suggest that you take some time to look at the study itself and some of the details. And one of the other things I want to highlight before I get to those last two bullet points, those quotes there, you see there, is that the study found that members of the Black community compared to whites are killed at a rate of more than 3 times. I think it was 3.23 times more likely to be killed in law enforcement. And once again, they looked at a lot of metropolitan areas throughout the United States and found that members of the Black community are 3 times more likely to be killed than whites when they come in contact with law enforcement. This is not shocking. This study is consistent with any study that has come out of the last several years as it relates to the number of Black people that are killed as they came in contact with law enforcement. And once again, I'm contextualizing this conversation relating to creating safe pathways, because in order, once again, to create safe pathways, we have to be aware of the challenges that exist, that are systemic and that continue, and that we have to combat. So when you look at those 2 bullet points there, that first one, that third bullet point, it says fatal police violence is a public health crisis that is preventable. Public health crisis. Right? So we have to confront it and see it as a public health issue that we have to solve, right? Because we can't continuously allow citizens to be killed unlawfully. And then once again, this cycle of going through these trials and most times law enforcement, even in cases like I go back way back several years into the 80s and the Rodney King beating, where you had clearly on video he was being beat and those officers got off, right? So it's also, I give that as an example, is that you can't assume because something has been videotaped that the lens that individuals of the jury, how they interpret it is the same way other individuals may interpret it, right? And then that last bullet point, the authors believe that this requires basic information. They believe when you read their analysis, they're saying we wanted to conduct this study because we realize this is important and that we have to do something about it. So once again, it's like, it's the study is not groundbreaking in what it found, but it is consistent with the other studies over the last several years. Once again, when we talk about the high rate in which members of the Black community, and remember, we're talking about when you come in contact with law enforcement. So that's why when we talk about these unlawful searches and other instances where individuals are stopped and they're not doing anything, and you're Black, it increases the chances that you will end up dead. And we have to be mindful of that. And once again, I will remind you of how I expressed to you the feelings after I found out about the Derek Chauvin verdict, about how emotional I was, because I was angry, because I knew not only that obviously I was glad to see Derek Chauvin was going to receive. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but he'll go to jail. But I was angry because I knew this wasn't be the last time that I would struggle with this issue. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So the criminalization of Black males. So this is what I did. I took a quote. I have an article, a journal article that's forthcoming. I think actually it'll be out in the next couple of weeks. So, but I looked at Black males' mental health and some of the challenges as it relates to schools not recognizing when Black males need support, and the important training we need to provide administrators and teachers as it relates to this particular topic. So I took this quote from the article. Like I said, hopefully it'll be out in a few weeks. And this ties back to this idea of how society views Black males. So in a few slides ago, I gave you some depictions of movies in terms of, and like I said, over the last several decades, in which interactions with Black males and law enforcement, how the directors and writers kind of unpacked what those situations look like, right? And in some situations ended up in the deaths of Black men, mirroring what happened in Derek Chauvin trial. But like I said, also we have to be aware. I heard my previous colleague is very active on social media, which is great, right? I'm active on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. But it's important to remember how various accounts, various platforms, social media, television, et cetera. As you see there, I talk about how these platforms assail Black men, right? So what happens frequently is they reinforce stereotypes, right? So we talk about incarceration rates and then test scores and health outcomes. So we can talk about, COVID-19. We talk about the issue, but we talk around the issue. But instead of focusing specifically on the issue that contributes to these challenges, right? So specifically, I'm talking about systemic racism. Right. So we talk about the mortality rates relates to Black and brown communities. If we talk about incarceration rates, all those issues, most of those issues are centered within housing. So we have to talk about housing segregation. So you can't talk about these issues without talking about housing segregation, without talking about limited economic development, right? So these are all issues that relates to race that you have to confront when we talk about some of these challenges. And once again, Black males are forced to kind of push against these stereotypes and misconceptions. And I talk about this a lot in my writing. I talk about counter narratives, right? But the challenges is that a lot of this information is because while social media can be great, the challenge is a lot of this information is all over in terms of these stereotypes and misconceptions, whether it's YouTube or TikTok or Twitter. There are groups of individuals that continue to push these negative stereotypes without centering within systemic racism, which is the core challenge we have to deal with as Americans. You go on to the next slide. Thank you. So as I kind of, begin to, finish this up in the last few slides here, is that, what does that look like in education? And I write a lot about that. So one of my research threads, I look at the experience of Black students throughout the pre-K through PhD pipeline. So if you read some of my work, it might be about middle school students, or it might be about high school students, it might be about undergraduate students, it might be about graduate students. And the reason why I look at the experience of Black students throughout the pre-K through PhD pipeline, because there are a lot of similar challenges. And like I mentioned earlier, some of my work looks at race-based trauma. And so it's important to look at their experiences throughout the pipeline to see what kind of, once again, when I talk about pathways, is how do we clear some of these obstacles so Black males can thrive? Because the issue is not their willingness, right, or their commitment. It is the obstacles that we create in society that don't give them the opportunity to go on and be successful, right? To live the American dream is this, you often hear throughout this country's history. They can't do that if you don't give them the opportunity. But if you create barriers and then say, well, I don't understand why you're not being successful. Once again, that's not clearing the pathway. That's creating obstacles. And we know education is a key metric in terms of success. So you see there that first bullet point in terms of the pre-K through pre-K through 12 pipeline, specifically as it relates to the school to prison pipeline. So we're talking about expulsion and suspension rates, particularly among Black males. Those numbers about Black women have gone up dramatically the last decade, but specifically Black males consistently have seen high suspension and expulsion rates. And we know when students are outside of school, they're missing time. And even if it's in school suspension, they're not in the classroom so they can pose questions, interact with students and teachers, right? So they're missing time. And in fact, a couple of my colleagues and I, we're working on we're just starting a journal article right now in which we've collected some data. And we looked at actually rural school districts in terms of suspension and expulsion rates. And the numbers are terrible, to put it bluntly. And we're working on that project as we speak. So in terms of higher education, there are a couple of studies, and I didn't think we had time to unpack them, but there are a number of studies that look at in terms of higher education, in terms of Black males on college campuses being stopped, whether it's in dormitories or walking campus at all, regardless of what time of night it is, going to the parking lot, right? So they're disproportionately likely to be stopped. And then they see that bullet point there. Do you belong here? Because that's really the message when this occurs. So a Black man, if they're on college campuses, they have to deal with these stressors on campus and off campus, right? And so ultimately the message is, why are you here? Why are you here? And that we don't want you here. And I know that, sometimes when I give these presentations and comments, from people, and they're like, well, this doesn't happen here. What I'm unpacking for you happens everywhere. And that's the problem. Right. And once again, as I said earlier, I believe in confronting these issues through my research, but also sharing with you my lived experiences and figuring out how, once again, we create these pathways. And before we move on to the last slide, I remind you once again, is education as a key metric to success, not just for Black males or Black women or Latino students, but all students, and unless you come from wealth. Right. So there's a connection between your educational background and your outcomes in terms of whether you have health insurance, whether you have money saved, whether you can buy a house, et cetera. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So I talk about knowing, right? So a lot of this I unpack knowing what we know, right? And I know that one of the themes here was social justice, but I want to be clear specifically, I'm talking about racial justice because I think it's important for us to highlight that. So now we're talking about doing. We talk about knowing. Now let's talk a little bit about doing before we move along here. So in terms of doing, it's really important that we bring in individuals who are, you can go on to the next slide, actually. Actually, no, I'm sorry, go back. I made a mistake, I'm sorry. What I want to say, because you have that same quote there, is that important that we bring in people who have an external review, right? So organizations struggle with this, and I'm talking about institutions in general, not necessarily post-secondary institutions, pre-K through 12, it could be a nonprofit organization, it could be a hospital, et cetera. So often when there's a challenge, something happens, someone says something from that organization that people talk about and it's overtly racist or sexist, they say, we're going to do some kind of, we're going to conduct some kind of, a review, and then we'll get back to you about what's going to happen. So I think internal reviews, because you have to check boxes, are important. But let me be clear that really what you need is external reviews, right? So there has to be individuals who can come in, who are not associated with the entity, come in, provide some kind of review and give you honest feedback. Because what happens often with internal reviews, now, this is not to say that all internal reviews, once again, you have to have some kind of checks and balances. But when you bring in an outside entity, they're more likely to give you, have an answer and be more of a critical eye in terms of if it's an event or a series of events. And let me give you an example of what I mean an event or a series of events. I just talked about the Derek Chauvin verdict this week, right? He'd be found guilty on 3 counts of murder. In 2017, Derek Chauvin, this is what I'm saying about internal reviews. Derek Chauvin beat a 17-year-old Black male and had his knee on his body for like 17 to 19 minutes. I'm bringing this up because the Department of Justice, DOJ, just announced that they're going to look at that 2017 incident, right? So now I'm giving you an example about internal and external review. This happened in 2017. Now the Department of Justice is looking at it in 2021. What would have happened if that internal review in 2017 would have seen what was on video? Let me add, it was also on video, that this 17-year-old, that Derek Chauvin, who was just found guilty of murder in 2021, had his knee on the body of a 17-year-old Black male who he also beat, who needed stitches. What would have happened in 2017 and if that internal investigation would have done what he needed to do? Maybe George Floyd would have been alive 4 years later. You understand where I'm going? You don't go with this issue. So we have to, when it comes about internal and external reviews, if we're going to have an internal review, which I understand, sometimes we need, or 9 times out of 10, you need an external review for someone else to come in and really look at what is happening. Because what you'll see is that there's often a pattern. You go on to the next slide. Thank you. So as a kind of finishing up here, so let's talk about what are you prepared to do? And there's that doing, the knowing and doing thing I played with a little bit there. The challenges require immediate action. So as I share with you my lived experience in my response to the Derek Chauvin trial, it's important for me to unpack that because I want you to understand that this has real lived, there are real implications for people that look like me, and that you need to be willing to take on these challenges. Second there, donating money and time to important organizations. I think one of my other colleagues who presented today mentioned this, right? So donating money and time is critically important. Challenging systems that block pathways. Once again, getting back to my title there and doing the right thing in terms of creating safe pathways, right? So if there are obstacles in the way, then we have to address those. And then lastly, ignoring the issues is not an option. So for me, I can't just ignore the issues and hope they go away because they undoubtedly impact the way my life and the life of people that I care about. So I implore you to do more, take more action to address these obstacles that stand in the way of Black males. Next slide, please. So as I conclude here, you can feel free to follow me on Twitter there at Larry J. Walker 2. So in conclusion, like I said, the title of this presentation is, doing the right thing, creating safe pathways for Black males. So I share with you in terms of connecting what happened in the Derek Chauvin trial to movie depictions of violence against Black males in movies over the last several decades to highlight for you that these challenges are not new. I also share with you the Harvard study in terms of a disproportionate rate in which Black people were killed by law enforcement in the United States. This study found that looking at data from 2013 to 17, that it was 3.23 times more compared to whites. And overall, once again, I encourage you to get involved, donate money, and to address these issues to ensure that we abide by the democratic principles that the forefathers of this country established years ago. Once again, thank you for the time, and I look forward to Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dr. Walker. Please join us in thanking each of our panelists for such powerful and reflective presentations. Now we will open the floor for a question and answer session. Dr. Walker, this is from Lindsay Pike. What advice do you have for us as we try to increase the knowledge of our students and colleagues about systemic racism? Is there a certain approach or what types of information that seem to have the most lasting impact and elicit action?
So thank you for your question. It's a tough question because I think through my presentation, if anyone ever see me present or any of my writing, I believe in confronting this issue. So one of the things, to give an example, is I gave a presentation last week, and one of the things I talked about is oftentimes there are people who will say things that people say, well, that kind of sounds racist. Well, if it kind of sounds racist, it probably is. So I would encourage, so when those instances occur, I encourage people to say something then and not go to colleagues and say, well, you know what, this was said earlier, and maybe I should have said something about it. And the point I'm trying to get to is I think you need to confront people and they have to talk about it. Now, I give presentations like this and talk about race a lot. And I know that depending on the constituency, it's a certain way sometimes you have to kind of spoon feed it to people. But overall, I think that it's important to talk about this issue, confront it, but also layer it with the experience. Like I said, I share my lived experiences. So if you can bring in a speaker who can, who can give you kind of an authentic, give you kind of share their authentic experiences, like I share with you, in talking about some of those issues. So bringing in people who they can actually see are the real people and can share to you, and you can see the pain in their face. Unfortunately, you don't want to see that, but this is the reality for this, right? Me talking about this issue was painful, but confronting people on these issues. Now, let me say this, that when you confront people, they're going to undoubtedly going to be people who push back. And if they do that, that's when you know you're doing the right thing. The other thing is why I say it's important, particularly for people when it comes to, I know we use the phrase allyship a lot, like for people who come from outside the Black community to push these issues, is that frankly, when people who don't look like me talk about racism, it's taken it differently. Let me give you an example. President Obama, whenever he really talked about racism, it was as if the world ended. Current President Joe Biden is talking about racism, white supremacy. And while people have an issue with it, there are fewer people taking an issue with it because he's an older white male talking about the topic, right? So if you have an opportunity to talk about these issues and you are someone who doesn't share my, or has a different lived experience of my own, I suggest to you that you bring in someone who can talk about this issue and also obviously provide articles and research and other things in terms of the data, the numbers, like the hard data. And I said, overall, just having a discussion about these topics. I hope that was helpful.
Yes. This is a question for each of our panelists. Where do we go from here?
You want me to go first since I'm already talking?
Go for it. Go for it.
Dr. Solander is telling me to go for it.
Go for it.
So let me say this. I think that the United States has reached an inflection point. And I don't say that lightly because I consider myself a student of history. But when I say it's an inflection point, it's just kind of like, an inflection points we reached after World War I, right? Or right after the Great Society programs in the 1960s were passed by LBJ. And then let me kind of contextualize it. After those Great Society programs in the 1960s, we got Richard Nixon and his Southern Strategy, right? So where are we going? Where are we going? I see Dr. Butler smiling. Where are we going? Where are we going as a country? The Derek Chauvin verdict, in my opinion, is an outlier, right? So what I'm saying to you is, I don't see that as the norm because statistically speaking, we know that law enforcement is not convicted, even if it's blatant, are not convicted of these kind of horrendous crimes. So where are we headed as a nation? Are we continue restricting the rights of people of color to vote because we know that demographics are shifting? Do we ignore issues related to police brutality and misconduct? Or do we address it through a policing bill that was passed by the House? Or are we going to compromise in the Senate? Now, I'm a former Hill staffer, so I had to put that in there. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, let's see. I think from this student of history that I look at where we've been and I look at what's been happening in the country. Last summer, everybody was so involved and so into it. And lately it's kind of seemed very performative to me, where people talk about racism. We must continue to move forward. We must continue to, I know people don't like to say defund the police, but I'd like to call it reimagine what we do with criminal justice and how we deal with people. I'd like to see us get more involved. And I say that all the time. It's really important for us to share our stories. I'm not sure if Dr. Walker or Dr. Morris have ever experienced this, but because you all are educated men, people don't believe that the police confront you or attack you the way that they do the what people see as criminals. We all have gotten that same treatment. I think we have to be open to change and not be so afraid of it. Change takes a little time, but we've got to be able to push forward, and continue to push forward to make change. Talk to each other. Don't be afraid to talk to each other, and we're all the same. We cut, we bleed red. We have to talk to each other about racism in this country and not be afraid to talk about it. Will there be changes? Yes, there's been a little change with every generation. And for 40 years, I've heard, oh, this young generation is going to make a change. They're going to make a change. And it's changed steady. But I think the change has come because as I saw multicultural marches, protest march last year, I think the change has come because we used to go to school integrated schools. Well, now we used to go to integrated schools and come back home to our segregated neighborhoods and our segregated churches. Now they're integrated churches, integrated neighborhoods, and we're living together. So we're understanding each other more. But we've really got to fight back against hate groups, talk about hate groups, talk and push forward with everything that we do. We can't be passive about this time. We have to keep the ball rolling and stay on our local officials, stay on our state officials, stay on our federal officials about passing laws that are going to be good for all people, but especially for people that have been disenfranchised during history, and that's Black people in America.
Yes, thank you to both of my colleagues on this panel, Dr. Butler and Dr. Walker. I think the importance of having some very serious conversation intentionally with those with whom you associate on a regular basis is important to this process. When I engage civic leaders, city leaders, and state leaders, I make a point to ask them about, because I'm a person of faith, I make a point to ask them about their faith, inquire about their faith. And then I proceed to ask them, does your faith impact the policies and the decisions that you make as a leader? And if they don't, why not? And so I say to them, as I say to each of us here, we've just got to begin having these kinds of conversations in our own circles, where we live, where we have our being, and push the envelope on these issues. We're seeing the Black Lives Matter movement and how it has expanded, not only in these United States, but worldwide around the George Floyd situation. And we've got to use this as a pivotal point. Like Dr. Walker is saying, this is that inflection point again in our nation. There are various inflection points in the rise and falls of societies. This is one, and we've got to capitalize on it so that we can begin to make the kinds of changes that we want to see happen.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Morris, Dr. Butler, and Dr. Walker. That will conclude our Q&A session. I will turn it over to my colleague, Michelle.
Anisha, we wrap up today's proceedings with a note of gratitude for Dr. Lou Stewart, the founder of the Third Wednesday Forum. Dr. Lou Stewart, a first-generation college student, was the first Black woman at UCF to achieve the rank as professor. Her research and courses explore culturally responsive teaching and student engagement approaches for teaching and mentoring students from diverse backgrounds. In addition to teaching courses in exceptional student education and the Supporting High Needs Population Certificate. She is a lead researcher on a state-funded grant designed to address preventative strategies in decreasing situational environmental circumstances that impede the growth and development of young Black males. She also is founding director of the Teacher Education for American Minorities Project to address recruitment, retention, and induction of people of color into teacher education. She has held local, regional, and national offices in the Delta Sigma Theta sorority and formerly served as a board member of DREF, the sorority's national philanthropy organization. To share her words with you. My father was a sharecropper and my mother a domestic. Both worked long hours tilling the soil or working in homes. My father signed his name with an X until I was 9 when I taught him how. My mother finished 6th grade, but was smarter and more determined than most people I know. They shared a common rhetoric. You don't have to do this. You can do better. Her parents' support, in spite of their struggle, ignited a passion to provide opportunities that manifest in her life and work, including this initiative. The dreams of my parents, DTAC TAG, and related organizations I work with in the community all share a mission, opportunity. In some small way, it is my dream to give back because so much has been given to me by so many. Dr. Lou Stewart, we thank you. Along with Dr. Lou Stewart, we would like to acknowledge Dr. Suzanne Martin, who together, the two of them have over 100 years of educational experience. Dr. Martin has served for 17 years as a professor and assistant dean and has teaching experience at the K-12 school and higher education levels. She has worked as an educational specialist at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of Special Education Programs, known as OSEP, for 4 years, including 2 years of acting branch chief of the Leadership Personnel Branch of the Department of Personnel Preparation. Dr. Martin has served as international president of the Council for Exceptional Children and as president of the Teacher Education Division of CEC. She was awarded the Teacher of Excellence Award, Teacher Education Division, and Pearson Publishing and Development in April 2009. She has been named one of the top 25 educators in the state of Florida. She currently directs a federally funded program titled the National Urban Special Education Leadership Initiative, which has a 100% graduation rate. We extend to you, Dr. Martin, our appreciation and gratitude for so many years of service. Dr. Martin, we thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Lou Stewart, and thank you to Dr. Martin for all that you have done for our community and all you have done nationally. We are so very thankful. We are appreciative of all of you that have taken time out of your Friday to join us. We know we're asking a lot, but we are going to ask you to register for one more session if you have not already. So if you have not registered for this evening session, we do have one more from 6:30 to 8:30 with very engaging panelists and keynote speaker. So please register. I believe that the registration link has been dropped into the chat, and we hope to see you. If you are not following us, please make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, because we will be sharing information when we start back up again next year. Dr. Lou Stewart, closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Slater. Thank you, colleagues. First, they came by Martin E. Moeller. First, they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. To Dr. Richard Lapchick, your story, both personal and profound, but more importantly, your work, simply just amazing, and that we are knowing and we're doing. to Reverend Dr. James T. Morris, although new to this community, but not new to this work. Your knowledge of local, state, and regional, along with national concerns, cause us all to pause, react, and act. Celestine Butler, your parents taught you well. As a lawyer, a pharmacist, a chronicler of all things social justice and equity, thank you. Dr. Larry Walker, you arrived here just in time. Our Black boys and our entire citizenry in the community in dire need of both your skills, another role model, your practitioner, as well as your research. From the UCF planning team of Danica, Erica, Michelle, Tani, Phoenicia, Dina, and myself, and to anyone that perhaps I have not recognized, to each of you who've joined us, we say thanks. This is our inaugural full-day symposium, and we dare to dream. You made that dream a reality, but we are not done yet. You don't want to miss the culminating session that's anchored by master teacher, leader, STEM leader, and principal, Dr. Stacy Mabry, along with our panelists, former interim superintendent of a major school district in Texas, Dr. Levita Levels, along with UCF researchers, Drs. Donnie Hale and Dr. Mary Little. Please know in closing, your voice is critically needed. Our children's lives are dependent on it. For each of you, we say thanks and hope to see you soon. That is from Danica, Erica, Michelle, Tani, Fanika, Dina, and myself. Thank you and have a good rest of the afternoon.